The parking garage beneath the Kessler Tower smelled like rain and gasoline when Megan Holloway stepped in front of 3 tons of armored Cadillac and refused to move. She was 27 years old, though the cold and the hunger had added years to her face. She wasn't thin the way the world wanted women to be. She was soft, heavy, the kind of body people's eyes slid right past on the sidewalk. Her sneakers were split at the toes. Her coat had belonged to a dead man, her father, and it still carried the faint smell of the hospital where she'd watched him go. She hadn't eaten since yesterday. She'd walked 3 miles through a Baltimore downpour at 4 a.m. to stand here, in a place she didn't belong, in front of a man the whole city was afraid of. "Stop," she said, and her voice cracked on the word. "Please, it's a trap. I watched 2 men put something under that car last night. If you drive out of here, you don't come back." The bodyguards laughed. One of them, a slab of a man named Frank, told her to get off the property before he called someone to drag her off. Another made a joke about her size, loud enough for her to hear, the way cruel men do when they've decided you're not really a person. Megan didn't move. She'd been invisible for 8 months, chased out of diners, stepped over by commuters, threatened by cops who looked at her like she was garbage that had learned to walk. She knew exactly what these men saw when they looked at her. A homeless woman, a nobody, a joke. And she'd come anyway, because she was a nurse before she was nothing, and a nurse doesn't watch a man walk into... Raymond Kessler stepped out into the gray light. He was 37, tall, expensively dressed, with the kind of stillness that made grown men go quiet when he entered a room. He ran the port. He ran half the money on the East Coast that didn't like to be counted. He'd buried his own brother 12 years ago, a brother who'd once begged him to listen, who'd died because Ray wouldn't, and he hadn't let a single soul close since. His men expected him to wave her off, maybe worse. Instead, Ray looked at her, not through her, the way everyone else did. At her. At the desperation in a face nobody had bothered to really see in a very long time. And something in that look stopped him cold, because he'd seen it once before, on someone he'd failed. He raised one hand, and his men went silent. "Check the car," he said quietly. What they found under that Cadillac would unravel an empire, expose a traitor at the very heart of Ray Kessler's world, and force the most ruthless man in Baltimore to ask himself a question he'd spent 12 years running from. And it would all begin with a woman everyone had thrown away, the one person willing to risk her life for a man who, by every measure, didn't deserve it. If this story moves you even half as much as it moved me, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the people we overlook can be the ones who save us. And subscribe. Turn on notifications, because stories like this one don't come around often. Now, let's go back to where it all started, to the days before the darkness took everything from Megan Holloway. Not so long ago, Megan Holloway still believed that the world operated by reason, as long as people were willing to work hard enough within it. Before her life dissolved into a series of endings, she was 26 years old, a nursing student in her final clinical rotation at Mercy General Hospital in the heart of Baltimore. That hospital lived beneath cold, white fluorescent lights and the sharp scent of disinfectant, and Megan moved through those corridors as though she had been born to do this work. She wasn't the quickest student in her class, and she certainly wasn't the one her professors held up as a shining example, but she was the one patients called for when they wanted to be cared for, the one who lingered 3 minutes longer than the chart required, because sometimes those 3 minutes were the entire difference between a person feeling like nothing more than a body and feeling that they were still a human being. Her supervisor, a head nurse who had spent 30 years tied to the ward, once wrote exactly one line in an evaluation that Megan folded and kept in her wallet. "This girl knows how to listen." Only a few words, but to Megan, they carried more weight than any grade ever could. Megan had grown up in a row house in Highlandtown, the kind of working-class Baltimore neighborhood where everyone knew which porch light had just burned out, and no one bothered asking why. Her mother had left when Megan was little, a closed door she had stopped knocking on many years before. All she had left was her father, Daniel Holloway, a man who had spent 28 years unloading container ships down at the harbor until his knees and his lungs seemed to surrender at nearly the same time. Daniel was the reason Megan chose nursing. She had watched him come home with his face gray and his pain dull and constant, had seen him wave away doctors he couldn't afford to pay, and somewhere around the age of 12, she had decided that she would be the person who didn't turn away. He often teased her about it. "You can't save the whole world, Meg," he would say as he lowered himself into his armchair with a groan, and every time, she answered him the same way. "Not the whole world, just you, Old man, just you. The two of them didn't have much. Daniel's retirement benefit was small, and their savings were even thinner. But the row house was almost paid off, and their life had a rhythm that made it feel like enough. On Sunday mornings, he fried eggs exactly the way his own father had, with too much butter and too much pepper. At night, Megan studied at the kitchen table while he watched the Orioles lose with the devotion of a man who had never once considered changing the team he rooted for. On clear nights, he told stories about the harbor, about the ships. The cranes lit up like a second skyline, and the men he had worked beside for 3 decades. He spoke of that water as though it had raised him itself. Megan had a plan, and that plan was very simple. Pass the licensing exam, get hired at Mercy, then move both of them somewhere with an elevator so Daniel wouldn't have to wrestle with the stairs anymore. She had calculated it over and over again hundreds of times. With the salary of a full-time nurse, everything would be all right. It was truly possible. Then, at the beginning of that spring, Daniel began to cough. At first, they both gave it the same name her grandfather's cough had once carried. Too many years breathing diesel and harbor steam. Nothing a little rest couldn't fix. But the cough didn't ease. It deepened. It began waking him in the middle of the night, with a wet, tearing sound that carried through the thin wall between their bedrooms, leaving Megan lying awake, counting every second between each fit of coughing. She was a nursing student. She understood what she was hearing before she ever allowed herself to admit it. It took her 2 weeks to persuade him to see a doctor. Daniel hated doctors the way some men hated confession. Not because they didn't believe in it, but because they were afraid of what they would be told. When she finally got him into a clinic, she sat in the waiting room with a textbook open across her lap and couldn't read a single word, her leg bouncing so hard that the woman beside her moved to another seat. The doctor ordered chest imaging, then another scan, and then he stopped speaking in that light-hearted voice doctors used when they thought nothing was seriously wrong. Megan remembered the exact moment when the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. It wasn't from the word cancer. That word would come later, in another room, from another man. What came first was something very small. The doctor glanced over her father's chart, then looked up at Megan and quietly asked whether Daniel had any family who could help with what was coming. Family. As though she were already being measured for the weight of it. She tightened her grip around her father's hand and answered before Daniel could speak. "I am his family," she said. "I'll take care of him." She believed that, believed it completely. She didn't yet know how much that act of taking care would consume from her, or how a single illness, in a country where sickness could bankrupt the people who loved you, could take away a girl with a clear plan and a folded piece of paper that said, "This girl knows how to listen," then leave her behind with nothing in her hands. But that was the story that came later. That spring still held hope. There was still one door that hadn't yet closed. The name cancer arrived on a Thursday afternoon. In the other room Megan had already sensed was waiting for them, from the mouth of an oncology specialist who spoke so slowly and so kindly that the kindness itself hurt her even more. Lung cancer, stage 3, already spread. Daniel sat there listening with both hands resting still on his knees, nodding as though someone were explaining a fault in a ship engine, then turned to Megan and said, "All right, so what do we do next, Meg?" He asked her that question. This girl who was only 26 and hadn't even had time to finish her licensing exam, as though she were already a nurse, as though she had every answer. And she tried. She gave up the exam that was coming. She called the school and asked to postpone her clinical rotation. The voice of the person in charge on the other end, both sympathetic and clear. "You understand this will delay your graduation, don't you?" And Megan answered that she understood, though at that moment she didn't truly understand the full consequence of those 2 words. Slow down. She also quit her part-time job at the pharmacy, because between chemotherapy sessions, emergency room visits at midnight, and the long hours spent sitting in waiting rooms, there wasn't a single piece of time left to sell to anyone else. Chemotherapy wore Daniel down in waves. His gray hair fell out. The body that had once been able to carry loads down at the harbor shrank, until his shirts hung from him as though they were hanging from a wire hanger. Megan learned to do things no textbook had ever taught her. How to guide a grown man into the bathroom without taking away the last of his dignity. How to keep her voice steady while cleaning away the things he was ashamed she had to see. He apologized to her constantly. "I'm sorry, Meg," he kept saying, and every time he did, she answered, "Be quiet and finish your soup," and sometimes that made him laugh, and that laughter was the only thing that kept her standing. Then came the bills. They arrived before she could even understand them. Daniel's insurance, the fragile coverage he had managed to buy after retiring, approved a few things and denied the rest with printed letters written in language so cold it made her sick, not determined to be medically necessary. Outside coverage, patient responsible for payment. One injection in the hospital cost as much as a month's rent. One night in the hospital consumed more than his retirement benefit for an entire quarter. Megan called the insurance company again and again, put on hold for hours with scratchy hold music in her ear, transferred from one person to another, each one telling her to speak with some other department, until she realized the system wasn't broken at all. It had been designed exactly that way, designed to wear people down until they gave up. She didn't give up. She signed papers that allowed the hospital charges to pile up under her name. She ran her credit cards until they were declined. She sold his wedding ring after he held her hand and told her to go ahead and sell it. "Honey, your mother won't mind. She hated that ring anyway." And the two of them both pretended it was a joke. She also tried to sell her father's old, beaten-down car, but no buyer wanted it because of its terrible condition, so it remained parked outside. By fall, the debt had climbed beyond any number Megan dared say aloud, and Daniel was fading. He knew it before she did. One October night, as she was adjusting his pillow, he caught her wrist with a hand that was now nothing but skin over bone and said, "You have to stop burning money on me, Meg. I'm not worth you burying yourself like this." She told him not to say that again. He didn't say it again, but his eyes said it for him. Daniel Holloway died on a late November morning, in the small room filled with cold winter sunlight, with Megan's hand in his. There was no dramatic scene. His breathing simply grew farther and farther apart, and then, between two breaths, the next one never came. She sat there for a long time, still holding his hand, because letting go meant beginning the next part of her life, the part without him in it. When she finally left the hospital that afternoon, she walked outside carrying a bag of her father's belongings and a thick folder of debts that hadn't died with him. People said death wiped debts clean. People were wrong. The hospital bills were still there, under her name, and the world gave her exactly 3 days to grieve before it started asking her to pay. The house was gone faster than she had imagined. It turned out that during Daniel's final months, to gather enough money for each round of chemotherapy, Megan had remortgaged the row house he had almost paid off. Signing papers she wasn't clear-headed enough to read carefully through her exhaustion, and now those payments had come due while she no longer had any income to carry them. She called the bank in the same voice she had once used to call the insurance company, and received the same hollow politeness in return. They gave her a few months of grace, then a few letters, then a notice taped to the door. One February morning, a man in a thin jacket came to change the locks, while Megan stood on the sidewalk, holding a cardboard box filled with whatever she had managed to take with her, a few changes of clothes, her father's paperwork, and the photograph of the two of them standing in front of a ship at the harbor from the days when she had still been small enough to sit on his shoulders. The man didn't look at her once. He finished his work, climbed into his car, and drove away, leaving her standing before the childhood home that no longer belonged to her. She tried going to a temporary shelter on the south side of the city, but it was already full, the waiting list so long that the woman at the intake desk shook her head before Megan could even finish her sentence. She tried several other places. They were all the same. The only thing she had left with any value was her father's old 2004 Honda Civic. The only thing she hadn't sold because in the end, no one had wanted to buy it. So the car became home. She found a place to park at the edge of the industrial district along the harbor, where warehouses stood dark behind barbed wire fences, and at night, there was only the sound of ship horns carrying across the water, the sound her father had once loved, now the only thing that lulled her to sleep. During the day, she tried to keep herself presentable. She washed her face in gas station bathrooms, washed her hair in cold water, folded her clothes neatly in the trunk, as though order could still hold something in place. She applied for jobs, dozens of applications, but a blank permanent address and a long gap in her resume made people politely turn her down over the phone, and little by little, she came to understand that the world had a very clean way of stopping itself from seeing people who no longer had a place in it. People weren't cruel in the way of fists and beatings. They simply let their eyes slide over her the way they would slide over a lamppost. There was a small diner on Pratt Street, where she sometimes went in and ordered a cheap cup of coffee, just so she could sit in the warmth for a little while. The owner, a woman named Preston with a hard-lined face and tired eyes, ignored it at first. But one rainy morning, When Megan lingered a little too long beside her cold cup of coffee, Mrs. Preston walked over, planted both hands on her hips, and said loudly enough for the whole diner to hear that she was making the customers uncomfortable. Either order something else or get out. This isn't a place to hide from the rain. Megan stood up, her cheeks burning, murmured an apology, and stepped back out into the rain while she felt every eye in the diner stick to her back before quickly turning away, relieved that she was gone. Worse than Mrs. Preston was the police officer. A neighborhood patrol officer, a man with a heavy belly and a weary voice, had twice knocked on her car window at dawn, shining a flashlight into her sleepy face and telling her she couldn't sleep there. The second time, he said plainly, "If I catch you hanging around these warehouses again, I'll arrest you for loitering. You understand?" And he said it in the voice people used to chase away a wild animal that kept circling and wouldn't leave. Megan nodded, moved the car somewhere else, then quietly came back the next night, because she had nowhere else to go. She lay in the car on those nights, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin, listening to the ship horns, and telling herself that this wasn't the end, that she had once been someone useful, that somewhere beneath all this dust and weariness, there was still the girl someone had once written knew how to listen. She didn't fully believe it anymore, but she still told herself every night, because to stop saying it would mean letting go, and Megan Holloway had never known how to let go of anyone, even when that person was herself. By around her 5th month of living in the car, when summer poured fire down over the harbor district and the heat turned the inside of the Honda into an oven, Megan noticed that an old man kept watching her. His name was Walter Price. He was over 70, thin-framed, with calloused hands and a limp in his left leg that he never explained. He looked after an abandoned parking lot at the edge of the industrial district. Right beside an old shoe repair shop he still opened every day, though almost no one brought shoes in to be fixed anymore, as though keeping that shop alive was the way he kept himself alive. Walter never said much. The first time he approached her, he didn't say a single word about the fact that she was living in her car. He simply set a brown paper bag on the lid of the trash can near where she parked, gave one small nod, then limped away. Inside the bag were a ham sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. Megan sat staring at that bag for a long time before she dared touch it, because it had been so long since anyone had given her anything, without attaching a contemptuous look to it. After that, the paper bag appeared regularly, once every few days, always in the same place, always with no words attached. Sometimes it was a food container still warm, sometimes it was only a few slices of bread and a piece of cheese. He never lingered to wait for thanks, never acted as though he was granting her charity, and that quietness was exactly what made his kindness feel heavier and more sacred than anything anyone else had done for her. One evening, she left a small note on the lid of the trash can, written in haste. "Thank you. My name is Megan." And the next morning, beside the bag of food, there was a brief answer written in a trembling hand. "Walter, don't thank me. Just eat." Then, one July night, Walter left something else. A small metal flashlight, the kind that fit into the palm of a hand, with a note taped to the outside, for reading books. Megan didn't understand how he knew. She had never told him that she read every night, that in the trunk of her car she still kept a few old books picked up from a library donation bin, that reading was the only way her mind could leave that cramped car and go somewhere else for a few hours. And yet somehow, he knew. That night, she turned the flashlight on, cupped it beneath her thin blanket, and read until her eyes grew heavy, and for the first time in many months, she fell asleep without feeling utterly alone. From then on, the flashlight lay beneath her pillow every night, and it became the most precious possession she owned. Megan's compassion, that part of her humanity that poverty and humiliation still hadn't managed to kill, revealed itself again on a late summer afternoon. She heard a weak whimpering sound coming from behind a pile of rotting wooden pallets, and when she followed it, she found a stray dog, all bones and skin, with one hind leg trapped and ripped open by a sharp piece of sheet metal. Anyone else would probably have walked away. Megan couldn't. She knelt down in the dust, spoke to the animal in the gentle voice she had once used with patience, then slowly freed its leg. She tore a strip of cloth from the last clean t-shirt she owned to bandage the wound, and gave the dog half of the sandwich Walter had left her that evening, though her own stomach was growling too. The dog ate ravenously, then tucked its head into the palm of her hand, and Megan sat there in the sunset holding a living creature that had scarcely any more left than she did, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt that she was still a nurse, still a human being who could heal someone. Walter saw it from the doorway of his shoe shop. He said nothing, only gave one faint nod, as though he had just confirmed something he had suspected for a long time, that the girl, sleeping in the old car outside, the one the entire city had decided to stop seeing, still carried inside herself something most people with homes of their own had already lost. A few miles from the harbor district where Megan parked her car, in a world entirely different, though it shared the same skyline, Raymond Kessler owned almost everything the lights touched. By day, the Port of Baltimore operated on legal contracts, logistics companies, warehouses, and fleets of trucks bearing corporate names so ordinary they were dull. But at night, when the real ledgers were opened, nearly half the money flowing through those docks passed through Ray's hands, and most of that money was the kind that didn't like being counted, money that needed to be washed clean through layers of shell companies until it emerged on the other side looking perfectly respectable. Ray had built that empire over 12 years, piece by piece, with cold patience and a kind of discipline that made even the oldest veterans in the business wary of him. He wasn't the kind of boss who showed off. He didn't shout, didn't flaunt his wealth, didn't need anyone to know his name. Real power, he had understood long ago, was something that operated in silence. He lived on the top floor of Kessler Tower, in a vast penthouse of glass and marble overlooking the harbor. So beautiful it felt cold. So clean it felt empty. A place that looked more like a gallery than a home. There were no family photographs on the walls. There was no trace of anyone who had ever laughed inside those rooms. In the evenings, he often stood alone beside the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in his hand barely touching his lips, watching the lit cranes out on the docks, and counting the ships the way other people counted sheep, because sleep had long ago become a luxury his money couldn't buy. Night after night, he stayed awake until dawn, not because he was afraid, but because the stillness in that apartment too closely resembled something he wouldn't allow himself to name. On the night close to that fateful one, Ray had to handle a problem. A man inside his organization, a warehouse manager named Reyes, had been caught skimming from shipments and selling information to a small operation across the city. Ray's men brought him to an empty warehouse at midnight, and Ray arrived later, stepping inside in a dark suit without a single wrinkle, moving slowly as though he had all the time in the world. Reyes sat on a chair in the middle of the concrete floor, his face ashen, stammering pleas for mercy. Ray didn't raise his voice. He pulled over another chair, sat down across from him, and spoke in the low, even tone that made the whole room hold its breath. "Do you know what disappoints me most? Isn't the money. It's that I once put your name on the list of men I trusted." The man wept, promising to pay it back double, 10 times over. Ray only looked at him for a long while with eyes that held no trace of anger at all, something far more frightening than anger, then stood, buttoned his suit jacket again, and gave one small nod to Frank Delaney, his right-hand man standing silently in the shadows. Ray turned away before everything began. He never stayed to watch. It wasn't mercy. It was a rule. He gave the order but did not look, as though not witnessing it might somehow keep his hands clean in a way even he no longer believed. Reyes survived that night, beaten badly enough to remember the lesson for the rest of his life but still breathing. Because Ray rarely killed people recklessly. Death was expensive and inconvenient, and fear was far more useful. When Ray returned to the penthouse that night, it was already past 3 o'clock in the morning. He took off his suit jacket, hung it neatly, poured another glass of whiskey that he once again wouldn't drink, then stood in his usual place beside the glass window overlooking the harbor. The whole city stretched beneath his feet, millions of people sleeping in homes where someone was waiting for them to return. And Raymond Kessler, the most powerful man on these waters, the man an entire city feared, stood there alone in the most expensive room he knew, with not a single soul on earth to call his name when the sun came up. He had chosen this life. He told himself that, and he had almost believed it. There was one name Ray didn't allow anyone in the organization to mention, and it was the name of the only person he had ever truly loved. Thomas Kessler was his younger brother, 3 years behind him, and in the version of life that should have happened, the two brothers would have built all of this together. When they were young, when both of them were nothing more than street corner men trying to claw their way upward in a city that did not forgive weakness, Thomas had been the one with the heart, the one who laughed easily, the one who believed they could climb to the top and still keep something whole inside themselves. Ray was the cold mind, Thomas was the soul, and for years, that balance had kept Ray from becoming the man he had become now. Then, 12 years ago, everything collapsed. Ray was 25 then, ambitious and arrogant, already on his way to taking over the first docks, and he believed he controlled every piece on the board. Thomas did not believe that. In those final weeks, Thomas kept coming to him, worried, pressing him, saying something was wrong inside the organization, that he had heard things that kept him awake at night, that someone was setting a trap, and Ray was walking straight into it. But Ray, that younger Ray drunk on victory, brushed it all aside. "You're worrying too much, Tommy," he said. "I know more than you think I do. Let me handle it." He still remembered his brother's face exactly on the last night Thomas came looking for him, the urgency in his eyes, the rush in his voice. "Listen to me, Ray. Just this once. Please listen to me once." And Ray hadn't listened. He was busy. He was confident. He told his brother to go home, and they would talk about it tomorrow. 3 days later, they found Thomas in a burned-out car beneath an overpass on the edge of the city. And the police called it an accident. A young man driving too fast while drunk. And Ray, though he carried suspicions that would never lie still inside him, never found a single piece of evidence to dispute that conclusion. He buried his brother on a gray April afternoon, standing alone beside the grave long after everyone else had gone. And something inside him was buried with that coffin, too. The man who walked out of the cemetery that day was no longer the man who had walked in. The soul was gone. Only the cold mind remained, and Ray used that very mind to turn himself into something no trap could ever touch again. He locked his heart tight, pushed away everyone who could hurt him, and convinced himself that loneliness was a reasonable price to pay for safety. But there are things coldness can never kill. And for Ray, it was a question that kept returning to him in the blackest hours before dawn. What if he had listened that night? What if he had set his pride down long enough to believe, just once, the fear in his brother's eyes? For 12 years, he had lived with the belief that his own arrogance had killed Thomas, that his brother had died because the only older brother in the world he trusted had refused to hear him speak. That was the wound he kept hidden beneath every layer of expensive suits and every cold command. The real reason he never slept through a full night, the ghost that stood with him beside the glass window every dawn. And because of that, though Ray did not know it yet, when a ragged woman fell to her knees in front of his car in the rain and begged him to hear her just once, to believe her just once, she touched the only place inside Raymond Kessler that could still bleed. A few days before that fateful night, on the other side of the city, in a discreet office behind a nightclub he owned, Gideon Voss sat looking out the window and calculating the death of Raymond Kessler the way another man might calculate a business deal. Voss was past 50, a broad-built man with neatly cut salt and pepper hair and the eyes of a shark, cold and never blinking quite enough. For many years, he had run smaller operations along the edges of Ray's territory, patient, quiet, always smiling whenever the two men crossed paths at meetings within their world, always calling Ray my friend in a voice sweet as honey. But beneath that polished surface was a hunger that had smoldered for so long it no longer looked like ambition. It had become an obsession. Voss wanted the harbor. He wanted the docks, the money laundering channels, the network Ray had spent 12 years weaving together, and he had waited long enough. The problem was that no one could face Raymond Kessler directly and survive. Ray's men were too loyal, Ray's system was too tightly sealed, and Ray himself was so careful he left almost no opening at all. Striking from the outside would be suicide, so Voss chose a more patient and far dirtier way. He struck from within. For nearly a year, he had quietly approached someone very close to Ray, someone standing inside the innermost circle of trust, someone Ray would never think of for even a second. Voss understood human nature well. He knew loyalty always had a price, and that the people who stood closest to power were often the most bitter, because they could see clearly everything they had helped build, but never truly owned. He had found that exact crack, poured money into it, poured promises into it, painted a future in which that informant would no longer be the shadow standing behind the throne, but would sit on the throne itself, under Voss's protection. And little by little, that crack had widened into a complete betrayal. The plan was drawn with meticulous care. There would be no gunfire, no street war that could drag in the police, the press, and revenge from the men who remained loyal to Ray. Raymond Kessler's death had to look like an accident, or at most like an anonymous hit that couldn't be traced back to anyone. A bomb attached beneath the undercarriage of his armored Cadillac, detonated at the exact moment he left Kessler Tower and headed down to the harbor in the morning, would settle everything in a matter of seconds. The informant knew Ray's schedule, knew what time he would come out to the car, knew which driver would be on duty, and even knew the blind spots in the underground parking garage camera system, the kinds of things only someone trusted absolutely could know. Voss hired 2 men who specialized in dirty work, 2 outsiders from beyond the city so no one could later trace the connection, and gave them the device along with the precise window of time. When the bomb exploded and Ray died, the informant would step forward amid the chaos, like a grief-stricken survivor, would take control while the organization reeled, then quietly hand it over to Voss in exchange for the reward he had been promised. An empire would change hands without a single bullet bearing Voss's name. He took a sip of liquor, smiled at the empty space before him, and thought he had accounted for every possibility. He had anticipated the reaction of Ray's men, anticipated the police, anticipated every piece on the chessboard, where he was certain he held the advantage. There was only one thing Gideon Voss never thought to calculate, because it lay beyond every calculation made by men like him, something too small, too invisible, too ordinary to appear in any equation of power. He never expected a homeless woman sleeping in an old car, someone who by chance would be in the wrong place on the very night when no witness was supposed to exist. The night everything changed began with rain. An autumn storm swept over Baltimore just after midnight, the kind of cold, sideways rain that slipped through every crack in the old Honda and turned the inside of the car into a place no one could endure for shelter. Water seeped through the rotting door seals and pooled around Megan's feet, and after an hour of shivering beneath a soaked blanket, she understood that she couldn't sleep in the car that night. She remembered an underground parking garage not far away, beneath a glass high-rise at the edge of downtown, a place she had slipped into a few times before to escape the worst nights. A hidden corner behind concrete pillars, where no camera could reach and no security guard cared enough to patrol. She pulled up the hood of her jacket, held Walter's flashlight tightly in her pocket like a charm, and walked through the rain toward it. The underground garage was dark and silent, with only the sound of water dripping somewhere and the smell of damp cement. Megan slipped into her familiar corner behind a row of pillars, spread a piece of cardboard on the floor, and was just about to close her eyes when she heard an engine. A dark van rolled down the ramp, its headlights turned off, and stopped only a few dozen steps from where she was hiding, right beside a glossy black Cadillac parked alone in its own space. Megan held her breath and pressed herself deep into the shadows behind the pillar. 2 men got out of the van. Both were dressed in dark clothes. Both wore gloves, and they moved with a quick, clean silence that belonged to men who had done this kind of work many times before. One was tall and thin, the other short and heavy, and neither of them said much as the shorter man slid onto his back on the concrete and moved beneath the Cadillac, pulling a small metal box and a coil of wire with him. Megan did not understand at once what she was seeing, but then the taller man, standing watch, spoke in a voice low enough to be cautious. Yet in the silence of the garage, it came through with chilling clarity. Hurry up, place it close to the axle, and connect the detonator. And that's it. Tomorrow morning he gets in the car and heads to the harbor at 8 o'clock like always. Once he's out of this ramp, we trigger it. Clean and simple. The man underneath muttered something. Then the clink of metal echoed out. And in that moment, Megan's mind, the mind that had been trained to recognize the signs of death, pieced everything together. A device fastened beneath the car. A specific time the next morning. A man who would step into that vehicle without knowing. This wasn't theft. This wasn't petty vandalism. This was a murder being assembled right in front of her, one screw at a time, coldly, the way someone repaired a machine. Her heart pounded so hard she was afraid they would hear it. She pressed her hand tightly over her mouth, trying not to let her breath turn into sound, and stood rooted behind the pillar, while the 2 men finished their work with terrifying calm. The shorter man crawled out from beneath the car, dusted off his hands, and nodded to the other. Then the taller man added one more sentence that would cling to Megan for hours afterward. Remember, no traces, no witnesses. Boss said it himself. If this gets exposed, you and I both end up as bodies floating in the river. The 2 men climbed back into the van, backed up the ramp, and vanished into the rain as silently as they had come, leaving Megan standing alone in the darkness with a bomb only a few steps away and a terrible truth placed entirely upon her shoulders. She stood there for a long time, trembling, and not only from the cold. She didn't know whose car it was. She didn't know who the man was who would die at 8 o'clock in the morning, whether he was good or bad, whether he deserved to live or deserved to die. She knew only one thing. the one thing that had been carved into her blood from the years when she had still worn a white coat, that tomorrow morning a human being would walk into his own death without knowing it, and she was the only person on earth who knew. Megan staggered out of the underground parking garage in the rain and walked almost aimlessly back toward her car, her mind spinning with what she had just witnessed. The first instinct, the instinct anyone would have, was to call the police. But that thought had barely sparked before it went out at once, because she remembered who she was in their eyes. She was the woman a police officer himself had threatened twice to arrest for loitering, the woman with no address, no proper papers, not even a phone to make a call. She imagined herself walking into a station at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, soaked through and trembling, telling some exhausted desk officer that she had just seen 2 men attach a bomb beneath a luxury car in a parking garage where she had no right to be. She knew exactly what would happen. They would look at her with pity mixed with suspicion, write down a few lines just for form, maybe even hold her for trespassing. And by 8 o'clock in the morning, no one would have time to do anything at all. The word of a homeless person carried no weight. She had learned that lesson bitterly over the past 8 months, that the world had a very neat way of shutting its ears to the people it had already decided to stop seeing. So she sat in the freezing car, hugging her knees, and tried to convince herself that this wasn't her business. She didn't know who that man was. Very possibly, he was a bad man, a criminal, someone the world would be better without. Because why else would anyone want him dead in such a cold and professional way? Leave it alone, a voice inside her whispered. You've got nothing left. Don't get tangled in something that'll kill you. Those 2 men said it clearly. No witnesses, and if they know you saw, you'll end up as a body floating in the river too. That was wise advice. That was the advice that would keep her alive. And Megan sat with it for hours in the darkness, torn between fear and something else buried deeper than fear. But when dawn drew near, when she closed her eyes, she saw nothing but her father's face in the hospital room during those final days, and she heard again the words he used to say as a joke, "You can't save the whole world, Meg," and the answer she always gave him, "Not the whole world, only the people I can reach." She thought of the words someone had once written about her. This girl knows how to listen, and she wondered what listening was worth if, when she heard death coming, she covered her own ears. She was a nurse, or she should have been one, and a nurse didn't weigh whether a life deserved saving before saving it. A nurse saw only a human being about to die, and the fact that one human being could still be saved. Whether that man was good or bad was not her question to answer. The only question was whether she could go on living with herself if she knew, and she stayed silent, and he died. She couldn't. She knew she couldn't from the very first second. All her struggling had only been her attempt to convince herself to do the easier thing, and she had failed at it, as she always failed whenever someone needed her. When the first gray streaks of dawn she knew where that glass high-rise stood, knew it was about 3 miles away, and knew that if the man was leaving in the car at 8 o'clock, she didn't have much time left. She tightened her grip once more around Walter's flashlight in her coat pocket, lowered her head against the rain, and began to walk, one step at a time through the empty, soaked streets, an exhausted and starving woman racing the dawn to save the life of a stranger she had never met. When Ray's mechanic slid beneath the Cadillac and immediately went rigid, then crawled back out with his face gone white and managed to say only one sentence. "There's a bomb, boss. Attached close to the axle. It's real." The entire underground parking garage sank into a silence, heavy as lead. Frank Delaney drew his gun by reflex, his eyes sweeping every exit. The bodyguards who had been mocking Megan only a few minutes earlier now stood frozen, pale-faced, staring at the ragged woman they had almost dragged away. And Raymond Kessler did not move. He stood still in the middle of that small chaos, his eyes still fixed on Megan, and for one long moment he said nothing at all, only looked at the woman who had just pulled him from the jaws of a death he had been walking straight into, without knowing it. Then he turned to Frank, his voice low and flat. "Call the technical team to disarm it. Quietly. No police. And take her upstairs." 2 of the bodyguards moved toward Megan, much more cautious this time, and she let them guide her into the elevator, her legs trembling so badly she wasn't sure whether it was from exhaustion or because someone had finally believed her. They took her to a high floor, into a conference room of stone and glass overlooking the whole city, where everything was so expensive and cold that Megan, in her soaked clothes and split shoes, felt as out of place as a stain on white cloth. Someone set a cup of hot coffee in front of her, but she didn't dare touch it. Ray walked in a few minutes later, his overcoat already removed, and sat down across from her on the other side of the long table. He didn't thank her. He only looked at her for a while with eyes that revealed nothing, then asked, "Who are you, and how did you know?" Megan told him. She told it in the flat, exhausted voice of someone who had no strength left for fear. Told him about the rain, about the underground parking garage she had slipped into for shelter, about the 2 men in the metal box, about the 8 o'clock time frame and the no witnesses sentence she had heard. Ray listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked more questions, one by one, sharp as a scalpel. How tall were the 2 men? What color was the van? What exact words did they say to each other? Did they mention any names? Megan answered everything, clearly, without adding or taking anything away, because she had nothing to hide and was too tired to invent lies. At one point, Ray frowned and asked her directly, "Why?" She looked up, not understanding. "Why did you walk 3 miles in the rain to save a man you don't know?" he said. "In this city, no one does anything without a reason. What do you want, money? Or are you working for someone?" And for the first time since she had entered that room, something inside Megan flared to life. She looked straight into the eyes of the most powerful man in the city, the man all of Baltimore feared, and said in a voice that did not tremble, "I don't want anything from you. I don't know who you are. And honestly, I don't care. I saw someone who was about to die, and I knew how to stop it. That's all. If you can't understand that, then that's your problem, not mine." The room went still. The bodyguards glanced at one another, waiting for a violent reaction, but Ray did not get angry. He only leaned back in his chair and looked at her with a different expression, something between astonishment and a feeling he hadn't had in a very long time, a real curiosity about another human being. It had been far too long since anyone had dared speak to him that way, without flattery, without fear, without calculation. Only then did he look more closely at her condition. The bruise spreading across her cheekbone where she had fallen and struck the concrete after being shoved down, her scraped and torn hands, her lips pale from cold and hunger. He called a name, Owen, and a calm older man carrying a leather bag stepped in. Dr. Owen Hart, the man who quietly tended the wounds Ray's organization couldn't take to a hospital. Owen sat beside Megan, gently tilted her face toward the light to examine the bruise, disinfected the scrapes on her hands with practiced fingers, and as he worked, he quietly observed that she was malnourished and severely exhausted. Megan sat still and let him bandage her, and when Owen asked when she had last eaten a proper meal, she couldn't answer. Through all of it, Ray remained seated where he was, saying nothing, only watching as the woman who had saved his life was cared for by someone else. And for the first time in 12 years, inside the cold fortress he had built around himself, something very quiet shifted. For the next 2 days, Ray kept Megan in an empty apartment inside the tower, a few floors below his penthouse. And while she slept her first sleep in a real bed after nearly a year, he set to work finding out who had wanted him dead. Ray was not a man who believed in coincidence. The bomb had been placed on the exact car he always used. On the exact morning he was scheduled to go down to the harbor, in the exact blind spot of the underground garage cameras that only a very small number of people knew about. The 2 hitmen were only hired hands. The truly dangerous person was the one who had given them his schedule, his habits, the openings in his own security system. In other words, whoever stood behind this had to be someone very close, someone inside his innermost circle, and that thought made even Ray feel a chill run down his spine. He had Frank quietly go back through everything, entry and exit records for the garage, call logs, unusual financial transactions, and thread by thread, all of it led back to the same name. Ray had refused to let himself consider, until there was no other choice. Conrad Mayhew, deputy head of finance for the organization, the man who had stood beside Ray for nearly 10 years, the man who kept the books, the man who knew exactly where the money flowed, the man Ray still invited to dinner on the rare occasions when he allowed anyone close. Mayhew was one of the very few people Ray would have called close, and that was exactly what made the betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Frank placed the evidence in front of Ray, a series of large payments flowing into an offshore account under the name of a shell company that, when traced backward, led to one link in Gideon Voss's chain, meetings Mayhew had hidden from the schedule, and a record showing that Mayhew's own account had accessed the parking garage camera system on the very night before the bomb was planted. Ray sat looking at those papers for a long time, his face showing nothing, but inside him was an anger so cold it was almost numb. The man he trusted had sold him to his enemy, had counted out the money exchanged for his life, had sat across from him at dinner and smiled while his hands were tightening the noose. Ray did not act right away. He knew Mayhew did not yet understand just how badly the plot had failed, did not yet know there was a witness, and a traitor who thought himself still safe would make mistakes. So Ray decided to let Mayhew keep playing his part a little longer while he cast his own net. But in the middle of all that, a new variable stepped in. One afternoon, a woman came to Kessler Tower and showed a police badge. Detective Sharon Blake, from the homicide unit of the Baltimore Police Department, a woman over 40 with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone far too used to being lied to. She said she was investigating Raymond Kessler, that she had been watching his organization for many months, and that she knew about the bomb even though Ray had tried to keep everything quiet. Ray received her with cold politeness, admitting nothing, denying nothing. But Blake had not come to arrest him, at least not today. She placed a thin file on the table and said Gideon Voss had also been in her sights for a long time, that Voss stood behind more filth than Ray could imagine, and that sometimes two people on opposite sides of the law happened to want the same man brought down. Megan, sitting silently in the corner of the room where Ray had allowed her to be present, watched the detective and couldn't begin to guess whose side she was on, whether Blake truly wanted to help or was only using this incident to set a larger trap for Ray himself. Ray did not trust her either, not one bit. But he was a good enough chess player to understand that when the enemy of your enemy extended a hand, sometimes you still took it, even when you were ready for the possibility that the hand was hiding a knife. An unwilling alliance had just been kindled inside that glass room, fragile, full of suspicion, and none of the three people present could know for certain whether it would lead them toward salvation or ruin. Megan stayed in the tower for a few more days, partly because Ray wanted to keep his only witness somewhere safe until he finished dealing with Mayhew and Voss, and partly because she had nowhere else to go. But she refused to sit still like an object being stored away. She cleaned the apartment they had given her, even though it was already clean, folded the towels in the bathroom into neat hospital corners, and every time someone brought food upstairs, she thanked them by name, leaving Ray's hard men unsettled because it had been far too long since anyone in that world had called them by their names with simple kindness. Her chance to prove she wasn't some freeloader living off charity came one evening, when one of Ray's men, a young guard named Mateo, was wounded in a clash at the docks and brought back to the tower instead of being taken to a hospital, because wounds from Ray's world couldn't be explained in front of emergency room doctors. Dr. Owen Hart was across the city at the time and would need at least 40 minutes to get there, and the young man was losing blood fast from a deep gash in his thigh, blood soaking red across the expensive carpet while several large men stood around him, armed to the teeth and completely helpless before something bullets couldn't solve. Megan didn't wait for anyone's permission. She rushed forward, dropped to her knees beside Mateo, tore open his pant leg so she could see the wound clearly, and immediately recognized the thing that made her go cold. Blood spurting in rhythm. An artery had been torn. She pressed both hands straight down on the bleeding point, ordered the nearest man to bring her a clean towel and something to tie with. "Your belt will do. Hurry." And her voice rang through the room with a calm authority that made men who normally took orders only from Ray suddenly obey without question. She tied a tourniquet above the wound, twisted it tight until the pulsing blood slowed, and then stopped completely, kept pressure on the injury, and reassured the panicked young man with the same gentle voice she had once used beside hospital beds. "Look at me. Listen to my voice. You're going to be all right. Just breathe with me." And she counted each breath with him until the panic began to ease. When Owen Hart finally arrived, he froze for a moment in the doorway at the sight before him, then knelt to examine Mateo and looked up to say plainly what everyone in the room had already seen. "This tourniquet was placed perfectly. She just kept him alive until I got here. A few more minutes and it would have been too late." Frank Delaney, the large man who had once coldly threatened to drag her out of the parking garage, stood there looking at Megan's hands, dark red with the blood of one of his own men, and for the first time, the look he gave her held no contempt at all, only something close to respect. After Owen had taken over Mateo's care and stabilized the bandage, one of the men awkwardly offered Megan a stack of cash, as though that was the only way they knew how to show gratitude, as though everything in the world could be turned into money. Megan looked at the cash, then looked up at the face of the man holding it, and shook her head. "I didn't do that for money," she said, "and I don't need your pity either." I did it because he was a human being bleeding in front of me, and I knew how to stop it. That's what I've always done. That's who I used to be. She stood, walked to the sink, and quietly washed the blood from her hands, while the entire room watched her in silence. Frank moved closer, hesitated for a brief moment, then said in his rough, hoarse voice, "You did good." And from a man like Frank, those 3 words were worth more than the money. Megan only nodded. She didn't need them to say it out loud. But deep inside, for the first time after nearly a year of being seen by the world as something useless and unwanted, she felt like someone useful again, someone with value, not because of anyone's pity, but because of her own hands and because of who she was. And in the doorway, standing silently where no one noticed him, Raymond Kessler had seen it all. Megan couldn't sleep that night. Too much adrenaline was still lingering in her body, too much blood she had just seen, and when the apartment began to feel too suffocating, she took the elevator up to the roof, to an open-air terrace where she assumed no one would be. She was wrong. Ray stood there alone beside the glass railing, a glass of whiskey in his hand that she would soon realize he almost never drank. Looking down at the harbor and the cranes lit in the night, she was about to turn away, but he spoke without looking back. "You can't sleep either." It wasn't a question. So she didn't answer, only stepped forward and stood some distance from him, the 2 of them looking out at the dark water together. They stood in silence for a long while, and that silence, strangely enough, felt easier than any words. Then Ray said, without looking at her, that he had seen her save Mateo today, that it had been a very long time since he had watched someone save a life instead of destroying one. Megan told him about her father, about the years he had spent unloading ships at the very harbor spread beneath their feet, about the way he had loved that water, about the illness that had eaten him away, and the system that had eaten her away along with him. She told him about the unfinished dream of becoming a nurse, about the piece of paper where someone had once written that she knew how to listen, about how close she had been to reaching the finish line before everything shattered. She didn't tell him to ask for pity. She told him like someone setting down a burden she had carried for too long. And Ray listened in a way few people had ever listened to her, without interrupting, without rushing to comfort her, simply, truly listening. When she finished, another silence fell between them, and then, so softly she almost didn't hear it, Ray began to speak about someone he had not spoken of to anyone in 12 years. He told her about a younger brother. He did not say much, because a man like Ray did not know how to pour out his heart, but each broken sentence he let out was heavier than any speech could have been. He told her there had once been someone who believed he could still be good, that this person had been the soul, while he had only been the mind, that there had been one night when that person had come to him, terrified, begging him to listen, to believe just once, and he had not listened. 3 days later, that person was dead. He did not give details, did not say the name, but Megan heard in his voice the abyss that 12 years still had not filled, and suddenly she understood something. "That's why you stopped the car," she said softly, "because I begged you to hear me just once." Ray did not answer, but his silence was the answer. She looked at the most powerful and coldest man in the city standing there in the darkness, and for the first time, she did not see a crime lord. She saw a human being imprisoned inside his own remorse, a man who had built a fortress around himself so no one could touch him, and also so no one could ever leave him again. Something shifted between them in that moment, a fragile thread tightening in the night air, and both of them felt it. Ray turned to look at her, truly look at her, the way he had looked at her for the first time in the rain, and for one brief moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink, close enough to be dangerous. But then he was the one who stepped back first. He drained the whiskey in one swallow, set the glass down on the railing with a decisive motion, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone cold as before, the icy shell closing over the glimpse that had just opened. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be busy." Megan understood that retreat, understood that he had just allowed her to see more than he allowed anyone to see, and was hurriedly closing the door again because it frightened him in a way bullets and enemies never had. She nodded and went back inside. But when the elevator doors closed, she could still feel his eyes on her back. And her heart, the heart that had forgotten that feeling for a very long time, was beating in a rhythm that made her feel both warm and afraid. Both of them lay awake that night, on 2 different floors of the same tower, for the same reason neither one dared to name. The truth did not come from Ray's own investigation, but from the thin file Detective Sharon Blake left behind. While tracing Gideon Voss's money to build a case for prosecution, Blake had dug deeper into his past than she had originally intended, and she found something that made even her go still, something she considered for a long time before deciding to give it to Ray, because she knew it would detonate something inside that man. She set the file on the table and said plainly, "There's something you need to know, and it won't be easy to hear." The file reached back 12 years, to a network Voss had once operated when he was still a rising man in their world, and to a name Ray had buried in his heart for 12 years, Thomas Kessler. According to what Blake had pieced together from old records, from the testimony of one of Voss's men who had died in prison last year, and from old money trails that were only now beginning to reveal themselves, Thomas's death had never been an accident. 12 years earlier, when Ray was only 25 and already on his way to taking over the first docks, Gideon Voss had seen in that ambitious young man a threat to his own future. Voss had planned to remove Ray even back then, but Thomas, the younger brother with the heart and the sharp ears, had heard whispers of something, had sensed the trap being laid, and that was why he had kept going to his older brother in those final weeks, frightened, pleading, begging Ray to listen. He had not been worrying too much the way Ray had brushed him off. He had been right. He had touched the truth. And when Voss realized that the younger brother knew too much and was trying to warn his target, he changed the plan. Instead of killing Ray, he killed Thomas, staging a burned-out car accident beneath an overpass, both to silence the witness, to send a warning, and to plant inside Ray a poison more effective than Ray's own death, guilt. Voss understood very well that a Raymond Kessler, who believed his own arrogance had killed his brother, would lock his heart away, isolate himself, turn himself into a cold and lonely man, and a man like that was far easier to manipulate, far easier to destroy, than a man who still had someone to live for. For 12 years, Voss had waited patiently, smiling and calling Ray my friend whenever they crossed paths, slowly tightening the circle around him, and the bomb beneath the Cadillac had only been the final move in a game he had been playing for more than a decade. Ray read the file in absolute silence. Megan was in the room with him, and she saw something on that man's face she had never seen before. Not anger, but a quiet and terrible collapse, as the foundation he had stood on for 12 years was pulled out from under him in a single moment. His brother had not died because Ray was arrogant. Thomas had died because he had been right, because he had tried to save him, because he had seen the truth Ray had refused to hear. The guilt Ray had carried for 12 years, the guilt that had shaped the whole man he had become, turned out to be a trap laid by his enemy, a chain Voss had carefully locked around his soul so Ray would imprison himself. Ray's hand tightened around the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and trembling in a way Megan had never heard before. 12 years, he said. He let me condemn myself for 12 years. He took my brother from me, then took away the very reason I might have forgiven myself. Megan said nothing. She only did what instinct told her to do. She stepped closer and placed a hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture that perhaps no one had dared make toward Raymond Kessler in many years. And that man, the one the whole city feared, did not push her hand away. In that moment, the cold anger inside him crystallized into something clear and sharp as steel. This was no longer a struggle for power against a business enemy. It had become a blood debt 12 years in the making, and this time, he knew exactly who he was fighting for. The next morning, something in Ray had changed, but not in the way Megan had hoped. All night, he had lain awake and thought, and the new truth about Thomas, instead of drawing him closer to her, drove him toward a cold and ruthless conclusion. Voss had killed his younger brother only because Thomas had been Ray's weakness, because he was the person Ray cared about, because Ray's enemies had always known that the surest way to destroy Raymond Kessler wasn't to aim at him, but to aim at the people he loved. And now, sitting in the room filled with early sunlight, Ray looked over at Megan as she quietly poured coffee, and he realized with a cold rush of horror that she had become that very thing, had become someone he cared about, had become exactly the kind of weakness that had gotten Thomas killed 12 years ago. If Voss, or any enemy among the many enemies Ray had, discovered that this homeless woman meant something to him, she would become a target. And Ray knew far too well what men like Voss did to targets. He hadn't been able to save Thomas. He wouldn't let history repeat itself with her. So he did what he believed was the only way to keep her safe. He pushed her away, and he did it cruelly, because he knew a gentle refusal wouldn't be enough to make someone like Megan leave. When she brought the cup of coffee closer, and began speaking to him in the soft voice that had become familiar between them. Ray cut her off in a voice as cold as ice. "I've had money prepared for you," he said. "Enough for you to leave Baltimore and start over somewhere else. You've done your part as a witness. I don't need you here anymore." Megan froze, the coffee cup suspended in midair, and she looked at him as though she wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. She asked softly, "Is this because of last night? Because you let me see?" Ray forced his face to remain empty, forced himself to say the words he knew would cut her deepest. "Don't confuse gratitude with something else," he said. "You did a good thing, and I've paid you decently for it. But you and I don't live in the same world, and if you think a few stories told in the dark mean you belong here, then you're lying to yourself. Look at yourself. Who you are and who I am." Every word was a knife, and he watched them sink into her, watched the light in her eyes go out little by little, and each one carved a matching wound into him that he did not allow himself to show. Megan stood still for a long time. Then she set the coffee cup down on the table, very gently, and when she spoke, there was no bitterness in her voice the way he had expected, only a sad understanding that made everything harder to bear. "You know," she said, "I've cared for enough frightened people to recognize when someone is pushing another person away because they truly want to, and when they're doing it because they're scared. You're scared, Raymond. I don't know what you're scared of, but don't tell me it's because I don't belong here." The words struck the target so precisely that Ray nearly broke, nearly told her the truth, that he was pushing her away precisely because she had begun to matter to him, that keeping her close meant hanging a target on her back. But he thought of Thomas in the burned car, and he swallowed that truth down, and he kept his stone-cold face in place until Megan finally turned away. She didn't take the money he had left for her. She only picked up Walter's small flashlight from the table, the only thing that truly belonged to her, clutched it in her hand, and walked out of the room without looking back. And Ray stood there in the middle of his cold penthouse, listening to the elevator doors close, and told himself that he had just done the right thing, that he had just saved her life, even as everything inside his chest was screaming the opposite. Megan left Kessler Tower that afternoon with the flashlight in her pocket and a cold emptiness in her chest, with no destination except the familiar harbor district where her old car was still waiting. She did not know that over the past few days, on the other side of the city, Gideon Voss had gradually pieced together the picture of what had ruined his perfect plan. The bomb had not exploded. Ray was still alive. And when Voss's men quietly made inquiries, they uncovered one detail that left him stunned and then furious, that there had been a witness. A homeless woman who had happened to shelter from the rain in the parking garage that night and had run to warn Ray. The variable Voss had considered too small, too invisible to calculate, had turned out to be the one thing that shattered his entire 12-year game. And Voss was not the sort of man who allowed such a variable to survive, but he needed to know where Megan was. And here the informant acted once again. Conrad Mayhew, still believing he had not been exposed, still playing his role as the loyal deputy finance officer, while secretly reporting to Voss, exploited his access to the tower's internal security logs. He dug up the reports where Ray's guards had previously tracked Megan's background and found the exact location of her old Honda Civic in the harbor district. He handed those specific coordinates to Voss the way a man might hand over a piece of merchandise. When night fell, Megan was sitting in her Honda, trying to sort through the broken pieces inside her, telling herself she had survived things worse than the rejection of a man she should never have let herself care about, when a black SUV rolled up and blocked the front of her car. She had only enough time to recognize danger in a single flash before the door was yanked open. She fought back, she screamed, she clawed, but there were two large men, and she was exhausted and faint with hunger after many days, and the struggle ended quickly. A damp cloth pressed over her face, a sharp, sweet chemical smell rushed into her nose, and her world went black. When Megan woke, she found herself in a wide, cold warehouse near the water's edge, her hands tied tightly behind a chair, her head pounding as though it had been split open. In front of her, sitting at ease on another chair as though he were waiting for a business appointment, was a broad-built man past 50, with salt and pepper hair and cold eyes that never blinked quite enough. He introduced himself with frightening politeness as Gideon Voss, and said he had very much wanted to meet the woman who had caused him so much trouble. He studied her with a look that was both curious and contemptuous, shaking his head as though he almost found it amusing that an entire 12-year plan of his had been ruined by a 27-year-old girl who slept in a car, someone with no home, no place, no one in the world who bothered to look at her. But Voss had not kidnapped her merely to satisfy his curiosity, he explained, in the calm voice of a man accustomed to treating human lives like numbers in a ledger. That she now had one final use. He knew, despite Ray's attempts to hide it, that this woman meant something to Raymond Kessler. Otherwise, Ray would never have kept her in the tower, never have placed men around her for protection. And anything that meant something to Ray was something Voss could use to draw him out of his fortress, lure him to a place of Voss's choosing, with no bodyguards, no advantage, so he could finish what the bomb had failed to do. Megan was the bait. He took out his own phone, took a photograph of her tied to the chair beneath the cold warehouse lights, and sent it straight to Raymond's personal number, which Mayhew had secretly provided, along with an address and a brief message. Alone, no police, none of your men, or she dies. You have 1 hour. Then he put the phone away, smiled at Megan, and said that now all they had to do was wait and see whether the heart Raymond Kessler kept insisting he no longer had was real after all. Megan sat there in the freezing warehouse, her wrists bleeding where the rope bit into her skin, and through the dirty window she could see the distant lights of Kessler Tower glowing against the night sky, and she wondered, with fear tightening so hard around her chest she could barely breathe, whether the man who had cruelly pushed her away to save her life was about to run straight into death to save her one more time. When the photograph appeared on Ray's phone screen, his whole world seemed to stop. Megan, tied to a chair inside a warehouse he recognized at once as one of Voss's old facilities by the water's edge, her face bruised and frightened yet still lifted with stubborn defiance. In that instant, every cold argument he had used to push her away collapsed, and the only thing left was a naked fear he hadn't allowed himself to feel for 12 years. The fear of losing someone he cared about. He had pushed her away so she would be safe, and that very thing had left her alone when they came for her. This time, he wouldn't repeat the mistake of 12 years ago. This time, he would go. But Ray was no longer the arrogant 25-year-old who rushed straight into a trap. He knew this was a trap. Knew Voss wanted him to come alone, without weapons, without men, so he could finish him. And he had learned, at the highest price of his life, that he had to listen. He called Sharon Blake. He placed on the table the one thing she had been waiting for a long time. Testimony, evidence against Voss, against Mayhew, against all of it, in exchange for one thing only: send people to save the girl and take Voss alive by the law. Blake, who had hovered between two sides all this time, finally chose, and her choice was a tactical team with a lawful search warrant targeting Voss's facility, a police operation, not a gangland execution. Ray went to that warehouse exactly as Voss demanded, alone, through the front door, to keep Voss's eyes fixed on him, while Blake's people quietly surrounded the place from every side. Inside, Voss rose with a smile when he saw Ray step in, triumphant, believing that the 12-year chess game had finally reached checkmate. The two men faced each other in the cold warehouse, and Ray let him talk, let him brag about Thomas's death, about his patience, about how a homeless woman had nearly ruined everything, drawing out every second so Blake could close in. When Voss's men began to realize something was wrong, it was already too late. Headlights flared on, a loudspeaker rang out with the police command, and in that moment of chaos, gunfire broke loose. One of Voss's men, a young man panicked beyond reason, was hit and fell close to the chair where Megan had been tied, blood spreading quickly across the concrete floor. A stray fragment also grazed Megan's side, and she felt a hot, burning pain and warm blood soaking through her shirt. But amid the gunshots and shouting, what she saw was not her own wound, but the young man dying only a few steps away. When one of Blake's officers cut her ropes, Megan's first instinct, even though she herself was bleeding and growing faint, was to rush to that young man, press her trembling hands firmly over the wound in his chest to apply constant pressure, using that same steady, guiding voice she had used with Mateo, to hold on to the life of a man who belonged to the side that had kidnapped her. A police officer asked what she was doing. That's one of theirs. And Megan, her face white, her voice broken, only answered, "He's still a human being, and I'm still a nurse." That was the moment Ray, being held back by two officers behind her, saw the blood spreading across her shirt, and for the first time in his life, the man who did not know fear screamed a name with all the terror in his chest. Megan collapsed just after the ambulance arrived, exhausted and blood-drained, her body worn down by nearly a year of hunger and deprivation finally surrendering, and the hours that followed in the emergency room were the longest hours of Ray's life. He sat in the hospital hallway, the most powerful man in Baltimore, helpless and trembling, praying in a way he had long forgotten. Gideon Voss was arrested that very night, led away in handcuffs beneath the red and blue lights. And this time there would be no quiet death beneath an overpass, but the blinding light of justice, with charges of murder, kidnapping, and the death of Thomas Kessler 12 years earlier finally reopened. Conrad Mayhew was arrested a few hours later at his own home, his face collapsing when he realized the game was over, and his betrayal was fully exposed beneath the light of the law. Ray did not put his hands in anyone's blood that night. He had chosen another path, the path he hadn't been clear enough to choose 12 years before. And when the doctor finally stepped out and told him Megan was out of danger and would live, Raymond Kessler dropped his head into his hands and cried, for the first time since a gray April afternoon, 12 years earlier. 6 months later, the Baltimore harbor still looked the same to strangers, but to those who understood what had happened, almost everything had changed. Raymond Kessler had done something no one in that world believed possible. He had begun dismantling the very underground empire he had spent 12 years building. Through the cooperation he had negotiated with Detective Sharon Blake, he gradually moved the dockside operations onto a lawful path, turned shell companies into real logistics and transport businesses, cut off the dirty money streams, and took responsibility for part of his past in a way very few men in his position had ever dared to do. It wasn't redemption that happened in a single night, and it wasn't easy at all. But for the first time in 12 years, Ray could sleep through the night, because he was no longer building his life on a foundation of guilt that an enemy had planted inside his heart. Megan recovered. The wound at her side healed into a faint scar, and the body that had once been worn down by hunger and deprivation grew strong again, under care, and beneath a real roof. But what Ray did for her wasn't to hand her money and then watch from above, because through her, he had come to understand that true kindness is never charity handed down from the strong to the weak. He quietly paid off the medical debts that had weighed on her shoulders since the day her father died, the debts an entire system had used to turn her grief into chains, and he erased them not as a gift, but as the correction of something that should never have been allowed to happen. Then he did something more important. He gave her back the very dream life had torn from her hands. He funded her return to school, helped her complete the nursing program she had left unfinished, and earn the degree she had been so close to before everything collapsed. He didn't do it so she would owe him. He did it because he believed, with a certainty unlike anything he had ever believed before, that the world would be better with someone like Megan Holloway wearing a nurse's coat. And they did not stop there. Together, the two of them opened a free clinic right in the Harbor District, a place for the people the city had grown used to ignoring, the homeless, the working poor, the uninsured, the voiceless, the very people Megan herself had once been among. The clinic was named Daniel Holloway, so the name of the dock worker who had once loved those waters would be carved onto a place of healing instead of being forgotten. Walter Price, the old man who had once quietly left bags of food on the lid of a trash can, was invited to look after the clinic, and for the first time in many years, joy shone again in his tired eyes as he watched his quiet kindness grow into something an entire community could share. Even Mrs. Preston, the diner owner who had once driven Megan back out into the rain, came to them, quietly asking to cook hot meals for the clinic, and Megan accepted her without a single word of reproach, because she understood that giving someone a chance to become better was also a form of healing. On the clinic's opening day, as the people who had once been invisible sat down for the first time and were truly listened to by someone, Megan stood watching it all and took from her coat pocket a small piece of worn metal, the flashlight Walter had once given her with the note that said, "For reading books," the most precious possession she had owned during the darkest nights of her life. She placed it on a shelf near the clinic entrance, as a reminder that sometimes the smallest light, given by someone who has almost nothing to give, can lead a person through an entire long winter. And Raymond Kessler, the man who had once stood alone beside a cold glass window every dawn, now stood there beside her, no longer a crime lord and a homeless girl, but only two people who had once been broken and had healed together, two people who had saved each other in ways no money or power ever could. This story, dear friends, leaves us with something simple yet profound, that a person's worth never lies in the clothes they wear, the money they have, or the place where they sleep each night, but in the heart they carry with them, and that the person the whole world decides not to see is sometimes the very one who sees us most clearly and saves us when no one else is willing to stop. Kindness is never a waste. Respect for another human being is never a small thing, and sometimes one person willing to listen is enough to change an entire life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that every day, together with us, you can listen to more meaningful stories that move the human heart. How do you feel about Megan and Raymond's story? And what does it make you think of in your own life and the world around you? Have you ever unknowingly walked past someone who badly needed to be seen? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from the deepest place in your heart, because we always hope to listen to your own stories too. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May all of you watching this video always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and inner calm every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.